Masechet Moed Katan, Daf 26. We begin with the Baraita Tenora Banan. Ve'elu kera'in she'en mit'achin. In general, if someone loses a relative, he tears his clothing, and then after 30 days, he can mend it, except for the following very close or very important people. HaKoreh al aviv ve'al imo. So if someone tears his clothing because he loses his father or mother, that tear may never be mended. He has to keep it as a sign, as a memory forever of that loss. And if it's his own teacher who taught him most of the Torah that he knows, that's a very important, close relationship, right? Some say, the father and mother bring him into this world. It's and his rabbi that brings him into the next world. Balhan Nasi, and the head of the community, the head of the nation, the Nasi. I mean, in Roman times, he was called the Nasi, but he was in a way equivalent to the king when we had a king. And so all of the nation will tear their garment and never mend it. And the second greatest leader is the head of the national court. And also, if one hears about a national tragedy, like a pogrom or something, Hashem, and if someone hears someone curse God, say God's name in a curse form, he tears his clothes and never mends it. Seeing a Sefer Torah burning. And if someone goes and sees the cities of Judea, the Bet HaMikdash, meaning the Temple Mount, and Jerusalem, when they are when they are destroyed, he must tear for each one of these items. If one happens to see the Temple Mount first and sees the Bet HaMikdash destroyed, he tears. And then if he sees Jerusalem afterwards, we're going to talk about like which way one approaches. If you approach from the east, you actually could see the Bet HaMikdash first and only then see the rest of the city of Jerusalem at the time when it was destroyed. And then one would make a tear for the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash. And then instead of making a new tear, one could also increase the tear, just continue the tear, that same rip for Jerusalem. Okay, that is the Baraita, and we're going to discuss each item. How do we know the first three things on the list? When Elisha saw his teacher Eliyahu Navi go up to heaven in chariots of fire, he cried out and said, my father, the chariot of Israel. And their horsemen. In other words, Eliyahu was like an army for Israel, just like an army protects the nation. So too Eliyahu, as we're going to see through his prayers, through his instruction, protected the whole nation. And so that's Elisha's eulogy. So now he says, Avi, Avi. So for Elisha, he called him his father. So Zeh Avi ve'imo. So we learn from here that a father or mother, and anyone like that, one has to tear. Right, we're going to see in a second, Elisha actually tore his clothing. So that's what we learn, father and mother. And by calling him the chariot of Israel and his horsemen, that refers to someone's teacher who taught him most of his Torah. We ask about this. My mashma, how do you get from that? How do you get from chariots to a teacher that teaches him Torah? From the Aramaic translation of that pasuk that he says Avi Avi, it translates as, because not literally his father. That was not literally Elisha's father, but he was like a father figure in saying he's like his teacher. And he's not. In what sense is he like a chariot and horseman? Because he was good for Israel. In his prayers, like a chariot and horseman. And so therefore, as a rabbinic and teacher figure, he was equivalent to one's teacher who teaches him all of Torah. So here we learn these three people, father, mother, and teacher, are equivalent to that pasuk in Eliyahu compared to Elisha. Okay, and how do we know that one not only one tears for these relationships, but also you never mend it. Elisha held onto his clothing and tore it into two. So if it says I tore it, and if you tear something, it's going to be two pieces. Why do you have to tell me that he tore it and it became two pieces? So the extra words, two pieces, means that not only do you tear it, but you leave it torn forever. Okay, good. So now we have the first items on the list. Last question. Eliyahu, it never actually says that Eliyahu HaNavi died. It just says he went up to heaven. It sounds like he's still alive up there, right? And that's the source of lots of traditions, that he comes to Brit Milah, he comes to the Pesach Seder and so on. So it's true. Nevertheless, for Elisha never saw him again. So he was dead to Elisha. Elisha therefore had to mourn over him as if he was dead. Nasi, Vav Betin Ushmot Ra'ot Min Elan. So the next three items on the list. How do we know that one tears for them also and never mends it? Dichtiv Vaychazek David bibgadav vayikra'em vegam kol hanashim asher ito vayispedu vayibchu vayasumu ad ha'arev al Shaul v'al Yonatan beno v'al Am Adonai v'al Bet Yisrael ki nafelu becharev. Okay, in the first chapter in Shemuel Bet, describes that David heard the news that Shaul, King Shaul, and his son Yonatan died in battle along with many other people. And so David held on to his clothing and tore them. And all the other people also, they tore their clothing. And they mourned and cried and fasted that day and it says, list them, on Shaul, on Yonatan, and on the other members of the nation who died by sword. So Shaul Zenasi. Shaul represents, he was the king, so he has the same status as the Nasi, like Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He wasn't called a king, but he held the same position like a king, and therefore everybody tears for him. Yonatan, Ze'av Betin. Yonatan was second in command, and the second most important job there in the Jewish community during Roman times would be the Av Betin, the head of the court. And he also tore. In other words, he would have torn for any of these things. He also tore upon hearing that a great many people of the Bnei Israel died in battle as well. And so from here we learn that when one hears a bad news about some national tragedy, one also should tear his clothes. Amar leRab bar Shaba leRav Kahana. Vema ad dehavu kuluhu. Question: maybe one only tears if one hears all three of these items. If only you only tear your clothes if you hear that the king, the Nasi, the Av Betin, and a national tragedy. Only if it all happened at once, because that's what happened there. No, it can't be, because you see that this includes the word al. He tore his clothes on Shaul, and then also on Yonatan, and also on the death of many people. So each of them would be a reason to tear clothing separately. Do we really tear clothes when we hear bad news? Here's a case of that was pretty bad news, and yet they did not tear their clothes. One time, the report was given to Shemuel, the Amorah, the first generation Amorah, that Shevor Malka, that's King Shapur, he was the king of Persia, of the Sasanian Empire, where Shemuel lived. In fact, they had a close relationship. They would converse with each other, King Shapur and Shemuel. King Shapur ruled over Persia from 241 to 272. That's the first and second generations of Amoraim. And once he heard a report that King Shapur killed 12,000 Jews in this Mizigat Kesaria. This is not Kesaria that we know in Israel. This is another city that also is named after Caesar, that's in modern day Turkey. And Shemuel heard this terrible news, and yet he did not tear his clothes. So according to this, one does not tear one's clothes on bad news. And the answer is, Lo amru ela berov sibur uchmaseh shehaya. One only tears when it's bad news in the majority of the community. Now, something that happens on a national level, like the war of Shaul, and one hears bad news, then yes. But this was a local problem, even though it was still terrible and still a lot of people, but nevertheless, it was a local tragedy, not a national one. Okay. Now, what's going on with the story? Did King Shapur really kill all these Jews? Shapur Malka actually boasted once to Shemuel how nice he was to the Jews. He said, "You should give me credit. I never even killed any Jews." Okay, he deserves credit for that. The answer is, in that case, the Jews brought it upon themselves. As Rabbi Ameh said, the sound of the harp strings that was in this city was so loud that it breached the walls of Laodicea. Okay, the idea is that there was always a fight. There was always wars between the Persians and the Romans, and the Romans kept trying to come in, and so there was some rebellion sometimes within Persia of those who thought that the Romans would win. And so one time in this city in Turkey, there was a rebellion, Roman-led rebellion against the Persians, and the Jews in that city were happy about the rebellion. They joined in the rebellion against King Shapur. And so if there's a rebellion, King Shapur has no other choice than to put it down and kill anyone who is part of the rebellion against him. And so that's simply politics and to be expected. And so, in other words, it wasn't a particularly anti-Semitic that he was attacking the Jews because they were Jews, but rather it was a local rebellion that he put down. And so, as unfortunate as it was not considered a national tragedy, but a local thing. And therefore, Shemuel did not tear his clothes. All right, very interesting. Al Birkat Hashem min elan. How do you know that we tear clothes when one hears the name of God being cursed? Dichtiv. Here it says blessed, right? But we use that as a euphemism. We don't want to say even curse. Dichtiv vayavo Eliakim ben Chilkiah asher al habayit v'shebna Sofed v'yoach ben Asaf hamaskir el Chizkiyahu keru'eh begadim. Okay, this is the story when Ashur, right, from the north came and exiled the 10 northern tribes and continued to Jerusalem and almost conquered Jerusalem. And the head of the army was Rabshakeh. That name actually means the head of the army. And Rabshakeh, the head of the Assyrian army, came on. He was at the walls of Jerusalem, saying all kinds of horrible, terrible things about how they're going to be destroyed. And although it doesn't say explicitly in his long speech that he cursed God, we would assume that he said a lot of negative things and he did curse God. And at that time, all these Jewish officers, the Kim Chilkiah, the scribe, all the recorder, they came to Chizkiah with their clothes torn. Why did they tear their clothes? Must be because they heard Rav Shekeh's speech and they heard all the curses that he said. And that's why they tore their clothes. Therefore, we have to tear our clothes when we hear such terrible things. The Baraita says, not only someone who hears it directly from, let's say, like an evil person like Rav Shekeh, even if you hear it secondhand. In other words, someone was there and they repeat it and say, listen, I was just at that place and someone said, and he then says the curse formula, even though he's not saying it himself because he means it, he's just repeating what someone else said. Nevertheless, because you heard that formula, you have to tear your clothes. And so this comes to a paradoxical situation. If someone curses God, then we bring him to court, right? And he would get capital punishment, but only if there are witnesses. So the witnesses come to court and they have to repeat what they heard, right? At least one time during the proceedings, they have to say, they can't just say, we heard him curse God. The judges have to hear exactly what he said. And so therefore the witnesses, or at least one of the witnesses, is going to have to repeat the curse. and the other witness is going to hear, right, his friend saying it. Nevertheless, even though the witness is hearing a curse formula, the witness himself, since he already heard it the first time when the evil perpetrator said it, the witness does not have to tear on hearing it a second time. Even though the judges, because they didn't hear it the first time, they're only hearing it now from the witness, the judges would have to tear, but the witness does not have to tear for hearing it a second time. Okay, we ask about that. So what if the witnesses heard it already the first time when the perpetrator said it? Now one witness is hearing it again from the other witness, so he should have to tear again, right? No, don't think that. After all, in the story that we just mentioned, when those people who heard Rav Shakeh, the ministers who heard Rav Shakeh curse, they tore their clothes once when they were there at the spot. They came to the king and reported what they heard to the king. When the king heard it, the king tore his clothing, but the ministers did not tear their clothing again. And so from here, you learn that when someone is just testifying about what he heard, the witness does not have to tear again, but those who are now hearing it for the first time, even though they're hearing it secondhand, do have to tear their clothing. Okay, and how do you know that someone who hears God's name being cursed does not mend his clothing? Because it says the word kiri'ah here, and it said kiri'ah back there in the case of Elisha. And so we connect them, and just like there, for a father, mother, and teacher, one does not mend. So too, in these cases, one does not mend. Next case, Sefer Torah shenisraf min elan. How do you know we have to tear our clothing and not mend it for a Sefer Torah that is burnt? Tichtiv vayhi kikro Yehudi shalosh telatot v'arba'ah vayikreha betar hasofer v'ashlech el ha'esh asher el ha'ach. Okay, this is a story of the time of Yehoiakim. He's the third to last king of Judea. Not a very good king. And Yirmiyah once wrote down a scroll we're going to see that it's a scroll of many of his prophecies. The Gemara is going to interpret as a scroll of the Megillat Echa, maybe other things too. And he said, he told Baruch, go read it to Yehoiakim, and maybe that'll change his mind. And so he reads it in public, then he reads it to Yehoiakim. And Yehoiakim, when Yehudi, this servant, would read three over here and understands it as leaves. He would read 3 leaves from the scroll. So then the king would cut it with a knife and throw it into the fire. So he's taking these words of Tanakh and throwing them into the fire. And okay. So now we want to ask, what does this mean? 3 or 4 leaves. So Amru le Yehoiakim Katav Yirmiyah Sefer Kinot. So they told Yehoiakim, Yirmiyah wrote a book, and this is Kinot, meaning Echa. Amalu Maketibe. So the king said, well, what's written in it? It says, Echa Yasheva Badad. Look how Jerusalem is sitting alone. Malu Ana Malka. Yehoiakim says, I don't care about that. I'm the king. So maybe other people will go into exile and it'll be alone, but I'll be okay because I'm king. The people are going to be crying at night. And he said, Ana Malka, I'll be protected. I'm above these problems. Ana Malka. It says in Echa that Judah will be exiled and afflicted. And he said, I'm the king. I'll be above these problems. He continued reading that the streets will be empty. And he says, I'm the king. It won't affect me. I don't care if it affects other people in my kingdom. Right? You see what kind of king he was. And then they continued reading to him. Her enemies have become the chiefs. So now he can't just say, I'm king, because according to this, if it's true, then the enemies will come and they'll be replace the king. And he said, okay, who said that? Whose authority? And the next pasuk right there is Ki Adonai Hoga Aldo Pesha'eha. Right? Hashem said this, and Hashem has afflicted her because of her transgressions. So he heard that, Yehoiakim heard that, and he got upset. Miyad kadar kol askarot sheba'u shafan ba'esh. You're saying Hashem is going to do this? So he went and he cut all the names of God that were in the Megillah, and he threw them into the fire, the fireplace that was right near him. And then going back to Yirmiyah, that tells the story, the very next pasuk says, when this happened, they were not afraid and they did not tear their garments, right? The kings and the servants, they were all evil and they didn't care about it. So what do you learn from this? That they should have been afraid. They should have torn their garments. They should have torn their garments because they saw these words of scripture being thrown into the fire. And this is where we learn that anytime you see Sefer Torah or other works of scripture being burnt, one should tear his clothes. Papa asks a good question. Maybe the reason that they should have torn their clothes isn't because the parchment itself was being burnt, but rather they should have torn about what they were hearing. They were hearing about all these terrible curses and promises of destruction. And that's the bad news. They should have said, oh no, look at these terrible warnings. We better tear our clothes. That actually does seem to be the peshat. But he responded, no, at that time, these were only warnings of future destruction. So one does not tear clothes on something that didn't happen yet. And therefore, since nothing bad actually happened yet, the Beit HaMikdash was not destroyed, Jerusalem was not exiled just yet. I mean, it would soon. But since it didn't happen yet, it must be that they should have torn their clothing because of scripture being burnt. Rabbi Rav Huna says not only once, but someone who sees Sefer Torah being burnt should tear 2 tears in his clothes. One for the parchment and one for the writing itself. Right? After all, you can't really have writing unless you have you can't have foreground without background. And so both the parchment itself is holy and the actual ink, the writing is holy. Back to that story, it says after the king burnt the scroll and the words, so both the kind of the physical burning and the words, the meanings of the words that are destroyed. It was an interesting story that Rabbi Abba and Rav Huna were in front of Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba had to go to the restroom and he was wearing tefillin. They would wear tefillin all day. And so he removed his tefillin and put it on the seat that he was sitting on. And then he went to the bathroom. He came back. Atai batna amita be'ale mi bela'eh. When he was out, an ostrich came and almost swallowed the tefillin. Ostriches apparently will eat anything that you put in front of them. By the way, this probably shows that their tefillin were smaller than the usual tefillin today. It would have to be the size an ostrich could just go and swallow. And they probably were also small because they did wear them all day and had to be comfortable enough. Okay, so he came back and saw that he would be able to save the tefillin from this hungry ostrich. But he said, he said, I almost would have to tear twice. Why twice? Because in the tefillin is words of Torah. And so we'd have to, if he did destroy it and eat it, he would have to tear on the parchment and on the writing. Amarle, however, his colleague Rav Huna told him, Mina lacha. What's your source for this? And Rav Huna continues and says, I had a similar situation where something was in fact destroyed. He didn't know the answer, how many times I should tear. I came to Rav Yehuda, and he gave me the answer. That one only tears twice upon seeing Sefer Torah burned or destroyed if it's done by force, like the incident that happened with Yehoiakim. Yehoiakim did it in a violent way. He says, give me that, and he tore it, and purposely, in order to desecrate the words, he threw them into the fire. If someone witnesses that, yes, they have to tear twice on the parchment and the writing. But if something's just a mistake, and somehow Tefillin, Sefer Torah, some part of Tanakh, or something gets destroyed, then it's just a mistake, and one would not have to tear twice. And so therefore, don't worry. You didn't want to desecrate your tefillin on purpose, right? You did what you had to do, and this ostrich, it was unexpected. So therefore, don't worry about it. Even if the ostrich did eat it, you wouldn't have to tear twice. Okay, next item on the list is that one tears clothing upon seeing Judea in ruin. How do we know? דכתיב ויבואו אנשים משכם משילה ומשומרון, שמונים איש מגולחי זקן וקרועי בגדים ומתגודדים ומנחה ולבונה בידם להביא בית אדוני. The story about the 80 people that came from the north, from the cities of Shechem and Shiloh and Shomeron, and they hadn't yet heard that the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed. And so they came with offerings to bring to the Bet HaMikdash. And eventually, when they came and they saw that it was destroyed, so they tore their clothes and they shaved their beards. Mitgodedim. Mitgodedim is they slashed their skin. Even though in Torah it says lo titgodedu, do not do that. It seems like they were following some kind of ancient custom and they did that. It's an interesting pasuk. Okay, anyway, the point is that when they saw Jerusalem in its destruction, Bet HaMikdash's destruction, they tore their clothes, and that's the source. And so now we see there's going to be three steps. When you're approaching and you see other cities on the outskirts of Jerusalem and he sees that they are in ruins, he should say, the pasuk from Yeshaya, the cities, your sacred cities have become like a wilderness, and he tears his clothes once. Yerushalayim b'churbana, omer Sion b'midbar hayata, Yerushalayim shemama. And then he comes closer and he sees Jerusalem, and he sees this all destroyed. And so then he would continue with the same pasuk and say, Sion became a wilderness, Yerushalayim desolation, and he tears twice, a second time. Bet HaMikdash bechurbano, and then when he approaches and gets closer, and he sees Harabayit and the Bet HaMikdash destroyed, Omer Bet Kodshenu Tifartenu Asher Helucha Botenu Haya Lisrefat Esh V'chol Machamadenu Haya Lechorba V'Koreya. He goes and reads the next pasuk in Yeshaya, right? Sacred and beautiful house where fathers praise you is burnt with fire, or pleasant things are laid waste, and he tears a third time. Okay, Korea. Now back to that Braita. The Braita actually had a different order. It depends on which way you come. If you come from the west, you'll see the city first, and then the Temple Mount. But if you come from the east, you actually see a Temple Mount first. And so in that case, Korea al Mikdash umosif al Yerushalayim. In that case, one sees the Mikdash first. He can tear for the Mikdash, and then when he sees the rest of Jerusalem, he will continue the same tear. Just make it elongated. What do you mean? We have another braita that contradicts this. Says and here it says someone who hears or sees Jerusalem destroyed when he gets to Sofim. Sofim means a lookout spot. It could be referring to Hadat Sofim. And here, if you're ever at Hadat Sofim at the Hebrew University campus, you can see this view of the Temple Mount. It's called that because you have a nice view. Or any place that one would have a view of Jerusalem and see it destroyed, that person would tear. And he should tear for the Bet HaMikdash, a separate tear, and for Jerusalem, its own tear. So here we have a contradiction because the Braita says you make one tear and you continue and make it longer. And here it says you have to make two separate tears on Bet HaMikdash and Jerusalem. So how do we resolve this? If one sees the Bet HaMikdash first, that's the worst thing. That's the most that's the most depressing thing. So then one makes a tear for Bet HaMikdash, and then if you see Jerusalem after that, you can continue the same tear. But if one sees Jerusalem first and makes a tear for Jerusalem, you can't just continue the same tear because the Bet HaMikdash needs its own tear. So if the Bet HaMikdash is first, it has its own tear. Fine, you can continue it as a continuation of the morning. So that really depends on which way you approach. Sinora banan, vechulan reshen lesholelan mololan luloktan lasotan kemin sulamot avalo laachotan. Okay, so we finished all the items on the list, and now we go on and say all those tears that we said you're not allowed to mend. You are allowed to do a temporary stitching. So you can tack them together with loose stitches. You can hem them, you can gather them together, and you can use this kind of imprecise ladder-like stitching. So it'll kind of look like this. So you kind of keep it together, but not fully mending. Amar Rav Chisda, or Alexander. When we say full mending, we're talking about this Alexandrian type of mending. In Alexandria, they would mend it, really stitch it together so perfectly, it's like as good as new. And that's what we're talking about. That's not allowed. Okay, now we a corollary to that law is, let's say someone did stitch it together in this loose way, and then he has a bad news sometime later. And let's say he wants to tear the same shirt on those stitches. No good, because those stitches are just temporary. In other words, that tear is still there. You can't just re-tear the same place where you just stitched it up, because those stitches were only temporary stitching anyway. But if he fully mended a garment, let's say he lost a brother, and he mended it totally, and then he lost someone else, and now he wants to tear on that mending, that's okay, because that's a full mending, and it's like the garment is all totally together. And on that also, Amar Rav Chisda b'chuy ha'Alexandri, it's only called a full mending if it's done in this Alexandrian style. That is a nice professional mending that looks like new. One can, if you really want to mend it, what you can do is you can take the shirt, this garment, and turn it upside down. So now what was at the neckline is now at the bottom. Since it's at the bottom, now it's like a different shirt. It's a new shirt. And so one can mend it because it's not a tear at the neckline anymore. Rabbi Shimon ben Lazar oseh lachoto. Rabbi Shimon says that I don't like that loophole, and he doesn't allow that. If one, let's say, has a shirt and he tore it because he lost his father or mother, and he can't mend it ever again, and now let's say he sells it, not the buyer also may never mend it, right? So just because you sold it in different, it's in different hands, no good. Therefore, when he sells it to the buyer, he has to say, listen, this is a shirt that was torn for my father and mother, and therefore it may not be mended. So take that into account when you figure out the price. Okay, this is like when manufacturers bring samples from overseas, right? At the customs office, they tear the sample so that they cannot be resold. Right? If someone would resell it anyway, you have to put it into the irregular bin so that the buyer knows, okay, these might have tears in it. If you're willing to buy it anyway for a cheaper price, then go for it. Okay, in this case, they can never be mended, not even by someone else. How much one does one have to tear? So the first tear has to be one tefach, right, which is 4 fingers. And then if someone hears sometime later, right, I'll say a month later that another relative died, and he wants to elongate the same tear, he can, and that would be shorter, only 3 etzbaot, because right, it's already still evident that this is clearly a tear because there's already a tefach there. Rabbi Yehuda says no, the first tear only has to be 3 etzbaot, that's enough. And if someone has to tear again for another loss, then even just making the tear a little bit longer, that's sufficient. And then Ula said that halacha is a compromise position. That first tear does have to be 1 tefach or 1 tefach long, and the halacha is that an additional tear can be even just a little bit is sufficient. Doesn't have to be 3 hand breaths. So he's machmir on one sense and mekel on the other one. Tanya namihachi to be omer techilat keriat tefach vetosefet koshu, and the Braita and Rabbi Yosef says exactly that. The first tear is a tefach, and the second tear can be just a little bit. Tenor banan amru lo met avi vekara met beno veosif. Someone heard news that his father died, and so he tore, right, a regular tear. And then, at some time later, he heard that his son died, and so now he adds more to the same tear. Now, let's say he wants to mend it. Well, the extra bit that he tore, that can be mended, but the first thing that he tore for his father cannot be mended. So even when you have a long tear, a combination, part of the part that's for his parents cannot, the part that's for other relatives he can. The opposite case is the same thing. One hears that his son died and he tears, and then he hears that his father died and he adds to it. In that case, the original tear, right, I guess like from the neckline till there, can be mended, and that extra which he did for his father cannot be mended because that part is for his father and can never be mended. Met aviv, met imo, met achiv, met achoto, korea keda echad lechulan. Okay, now we have a guy who's really in trouble. A lot of tragedy happened, sadly, for this guy. And he hears that his father and mother and brother and sister died. He can, if he hears about it all at the same time, either, I don't know, let's say there's some, plane crash or something, and they all died at the same time, or he hears about it afterwards and hears about it all at the same time, he doesn't have to tear 4 different tears for each relative, but rather one for everyone, because he heard all the bad news at the same time. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera omer al kulan keda echad, al aviv al imo keda echad, lefi she'en mosifin al keda aviv ve'imo. Rabbi ben Betera disagrees and he says he has to make 2 tears, one for all other relatives and another one for his father and mother, because father and mother you cannot add to that. You can't, father and mother require their own tearing. You can't take a previous tear and just add to it, right? One has to respect his father and mother more than everybody else, and therefore he has to mourn by tearing a separate tear just for them. Because they cannot be added to others. We're going to see that, like if one tears for a father and mother and then just continues tearing a little bit more, it's not recognizable that this is for other relatives. One will think, for a father and mother, he's just like really, really grieved and he's making a long tear. We're going to see in a second that tear can be all the way down to one's belly button. And so therefore it has to be separate to distinguish that grief from the others. Amar Shemuel, halacha Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, and halacha is in fact that one needs a separate tear for his father and mother. And the question is, Shemuel did really say that you need 2 separate tears? Shemuel has a general principle we say many times that we're always lenient regarding avelut, and so the lenient position would be 1 tear for all relatives, not 2, a separate one for parents. And the answer is avelut lechud, kriya lechud. Shemuel was only lenient regarding the laws of avelut. And discussing, how many days do you have to count, things like that. But the tearing itself is a separate matter, has its own separate laws. And therefore, Shemuel is actually stringent and requires a separate tear for parents. Adechan korea. How long? What's the? We did the minimum was a tefach. What will be the maximum? Ad tiburo, all the way up from his neckline until his belly button. And those, even if you're wearing a long cloak, it doesn't make sense to tear more than that. That's already not part of the main part of the shirt. And it's not going to be noticeable. Some say that ideally it should be until one's heart, from the neckline till one's heart. Pasuk in Yoel says that tear your hearts and not your garments. And those people were just tearing their garments pro forma, not feeling anything. And Yoel had to say, no, you should. The point of the action is just to prompt us to feel the mourning in our hearts. And so, therefore, the action should be equivalent to it. And so one would tear to his heart so that he takes to heart, right, the loss that he just experienced and mourn for it. If one, let's say someone has a shirt that he uses for anytime there's a tragedy, and he tears it, and he tears a little more, right, whenever he hears some bad news, and then he gets all the way to his belly button. In that case, he can't continue that tear anymore. Rather, he should start a new tear, 3 etzbaot away, all right, let's say on his neckline, and then he starts another tear down his shirt. Let's say the front of his shirt is all full of tears. Right, poor guy. I don't know. He hears a lot of bad news, or he hears a lot of cursing, or whatever it is, and now he has a lot of tears. It's interesting. The people would have a designated shirt, right? The torn shirt that they would use again and again. And if he filled up the entire front of it, then he can just turn it around, and then tear the back of it. I mean, the back will be the front. If that also gets filled up, then he can turn it upside down, and now the bottom, which is all whole, will be on top, and that will be on his neckline. Then he can tear that as well. It's interesting. I mean, kind of like when he's wearing the shirt, let's say, for a new person that dies, he's kind of revealing, and remembering all the past tragedies that happened to him all together. Someone who tears the bottom of his clothing or on the side, and not from the top, not from the neckline, is not considered a tearing. And that is true, and it has actually a use, which Kohen Gadol does not tear his clothes, does not show signs of mourning, even if he loses a relative. But the Kohen Gadol can tear the bottom of his cloak to show that he is in mourning. And since it's not an official tearing, so other mourners cannot use it, but the Kohen Gadol, who may not tear, can do that, and that way he can have at least some memory, some symbolism of the fact that he did lose a loved one. Machloket between these two Tanaim in the name of Shemuel's father and Levi, who argued about the soul. So Chadamar Kol Shiva Korea, Lachar Shiva Mosif. So one opinion says, let's say someone loses a loved one and he tears. So for 7 days, for those 7 days when he's mourning over person A, if he hears about another relative that died, then he has to make a new tear, because the first tear that he made for the first person, those 7 days, is like an active tear, like it's glowing. So if he just rips it more, he's just increasing the tear over person A who died, and so he has to make a new tear for person B. But after 7 days, that's it. He finished his main mourning period, and so that first tear that he made for person A who died, he can make it rip it more, and that will be evident as for a new person. Okay, that's one opinion. Second opinion says the same thing, but it has 30 days instead of 7. So if he has one relative that died, person A, and he tears, so that tear is active, kind of glowing, right? Is for that, designated for person A for 30 days. And if you would just increase it, then it would just seem like he's more sad about person A. And so if a second person dies in his life, then he has to make a new tear within 30 days. After 30 days, by then he can already mend that one. And so that one is no longer designated just for person A. So if he wants to not make a new tear, but continue the same one, he can continue the same one for person B after 30 days. So that's the question, 7 days or 30 days. And we're going to challenge each one. One who says after 7 days, what would be the reason? Because within the first 7 days, one's not even allowed to tack it or stitch it in a temporary way. So what you see from that is that, right, it has to be open. It's still an open wound. And so you can't use that for someone else. According to that logic, we did see an exception that a woman is allowed to tack it, let's say, like put a safety pin on her shirt for the purposes of modesty, and she can do that right away, even within the 7 days. So you might say, since she is allowed to put a safety pin on her blouse within 7 days, if she loses a second relative during the 7 days, therefore, it would make sense to say that she can continue the same tear and not have to make a new one, because you are made the 7 days dependent on the fact that the reason for 7 days is that we don't mend it at all, even stitch it together in the 7 days. So was that true? And we say no. Hatamishum kibod ishahu. No, the only reason why we allow women to put a safety pin is because of her honor. We should not modest to have her shirt open like that. And so therefore, that's the only reason, but not because that tear is no longer a tear, is no longer a designated tear. That tear is still active and still is meant for person A, and therefore even that opinion would agree that you can't use the same tear for a second person during the 7 days. Okay, so that's that logic of the first opinion. And the logic of the other opinion, that for anybody else except parents and the list we said before, you can mend the tear, a full professional mending, after 30 days. So before 30 days, it's meant for person A, so you can't just continue it. After 30 days, you can mend it. So that's it. That means that it's no longer significant. So that's why you could use the same tear and continue it for person B. So according to that, since for a parent, one can never mend it, so would that person say that tear for a parent, one cannot use even after 30 days? Because you see, it's designated and meant there forever and it can't be mended. And the answer is, no, that's not a law of mourning that one keeps that tear altogether, but rather for the honor of his parents, that never mends it. But really, the mourning itself is over, and that tear is no longer designated specifically for them, and so therefore one can continue and make that tear bigger for another person that dies after 30 days, even though the original tear is always there as a kind of remembrance for the respect of his parents, but not part of the mourning practices of his parents. Okay. This is an interesting case. Someone comes, he has his tear shirt that he always uses and that he tears whenever some bad news happens, and he goes and puts it on, and he goes and visits someone who's sitting shiva, and he's making it look like, oh look, see, I tore my shirt for you, or for this. He shows up to the funeral with that shirt, even though he didn't make any new tear in it for that deceased. Someone who does that is stealing from the dead and from the living, right? Stealing from the dead because he's showing as if he tore for this dead person, and from the living because he's showing all the people around, oh, look how sad I am for you, for your loss, even though he did not ruin his shirt just for them. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel someone says to his friend, would you mind lending me your shirt? I need to go visit my father who is sick. So, I mean, it implies very sick. And then if he goes there and he shows up and finds that his father actually has died. So he can tear his friend's shirt, even though it's a borrowed shirt, and he will mend it. And he returns the shirt to his friend. He pays for the mending, and he pays for the difference in price between a new shirt and a mended shirt. But if the friend said, can I borrow your shirt? This is sure. He doesn't tell him where he's going. He doesn't tell him that he's going to go visit his father who's on his deathbed. In that case, the friend who borrowed the shirt may not tear it, right? Because he doesn't have permission. So the point is, even if he didn't get explicit permission, if he says, I'm going to visit my father who's very sick, so the implication, the father knows that, the friend knows that, okay, the father may not make it, and this shirt may be torn. So he knows that, has that in mind, and he gives implicit permission for the friend to tear it. The friend still has to pay, but he can tear it. But if not, then he does not do it at all. And this would be the source of the law. If someone does go, let's say you go and visit Jerusalem. I mean, Jerusalem now is not destroyed. It's a thriving, bustling city. But the Temple Mount, this Beit HaMikdash, is still destroyed. If one does not want to tear his clothing, he's going for a bar mitzvah, he has a nice suit on. So what you can do is you can borrow someone else's shirt, switch jackets, or change shirts, or just give the shirt that you're wearing to your friend as a present. And in that case, you would not need to, and actually could not, tear your friend's shirt. And this story will be the source for that. If you have someone who's very sick, and the sick person lost a loved one, you don't have to tell the sick person. This unfortunately happens sometimes. It happens today. People with Alzheimer's, should you tell them that they lost their sister or not? So here it says, do not tell them, because then they will get depressed and their health condition will get even worse. And we don't tear our clothes in front of them, even though we're the relatives and where our clothes are torn. So we should not show the relative who's sick, that our clothing is torn. And the women who are the regular wailers, usually they would have women that were wailing and get everybody to cry. We tell them to be quiet and don't wail in front of the sick person, so that they shouldn't have to hear the bad news and feel even worse. The point is that there's no obligation to tell someone that they are a mourner if it's going to harm that person. A child who loses a relative, the children themselves do not have to practice the laws of mourning, but we tear the clothing of the child anyway in order to arouse grief in everybody else. Poor kid lost his whoever he lost. One should tear his clothing for his father-in-law or mother-in-law, even though they're not his parents, for the honor of his wife, to show his wife, I'm with you, and I care for you and with you in your loss. Okay, all these are not mostly not practiced today, and even the Mefashim Poskim say that these have fell out of use for the most part. This is a halacha l'maaseh that's found in Masechet Tzemachot, that a mourner should not be holding a small child in his lap, because babies make us smile and laugh, and that's not the appropriate emotion to have when one is mourning over a loved one. And people are going to see him, oh, look, he's laughing, smiling, and he just lost his parent, and they're going to say, oh, look how he's smiling and laughing after he lost his parent. And so that would be improper. Okay, that's a little more. The Mishnah mentioned that one does not have that first meal, the egg and the bread meal, on an upright bed, and provides the first meal only while the mourner is on an upright bed and not an overturned bed. In other words, they would eat the meal on a regular bed and then overturn the bed afterwards. So now we're going to learn, it depends on the case. So if you're going and visiting your friend and you're going to offer him that meal, has to be provided by other people. If his heart gaspa, here they say confident. I don't think that's a good translation. It means that if they're so friendly and happy, and like each other, that the mourner is going to be like, oh, what a great honor! You came over to my house, and having this meal together. And he's going to be enjoying the meal with his friend, with his close friend. Then you have to overturn the bed, because this is not a social event that your friend that you really love to see and you're having a meal with you. So therefore, overturn the bed to show that you're both that this is you're in mourning, and this is not a happy meal. V'im lav, but let's say it's just an acquaintance, not a close friend, and he's not going to be all happy and haughty, like, oh, look how you came to visit me, thank you, right? But it's just an acquaintance. Then you can have that meal on a regular chair. Okay, and now lastly, a story. Rava lost a relative. A bad thing happened to him. So his friend, acquaintance Abba came to console him and bring him the first meal. To Abba bar Minyomi, he's also known as Abba bar Minyomi. Rava Zekef. Rava sat on a regular chair, because he didn't feel like Abba was such a close friend that he was so happy to dine with him. Abba is just an acquaintance. So therefore he followed the second clause and sat on a regular chair. Abba bar Marta kafe. Abba Marta, he overturned the bed, thinking for Abba Marta, it's like, oh, this is my best friend and he's going to be happy, to see me. And so I better sit on an overturned bed. Amar kamalet be'da'ata. Okay, funny line. Rava says, look at this scholar has no sense, because can he see that I'm sitting on an upright bed? In other words, I'm treating him like just an acquaintance, but he seems to think that I think that he's my best friend. And that's why he overturned. So he's not picking up on the social cue that I'm just treating him like a regular person. And he says, oh, my best buddy, I better overturn so that this first meal will be a sad meal. And so even though it's a sad situation, it still is a funny story. Baruch Adonai Olam. Amen ve'amen.